So the type 3 hypersensitivity reactions also involve antibodies, but they're going to involve immune complexes. So remember, immune complex is just the antibody that's bound to the antigen. And what happens is they end up producing too many of these immune complexes, especially these small sized ones that are going to cause some problems. So normally the immune complexes are going to be phagocytized and eaten by the phagocytes, but because we've got a lot of these smaller ones and we've got too many of them, they end up lodging in the blood vessels in the tissue. And then that will activate the complement system, and then that will damage the tissue by inflammation. So there's quite a few examples of type 3 hypersensitivity reactions. So let's take a look at those in the next couple pictures. So here's just showing you these immune complexes. So remember, that's just the antibody bound to the antigen. That's an immune complex. So we just have too many of these, and they're kind of small in size. And they end up lodging in the blood vessel walls or in the tissue, activating the complement system, attracting neutrophils, and we end up releasing all these toxic chemicals. We get inflammation, and that will damage the blood vessel or the tissue site. So here's just showing you these immune complexes lodging in the tissue here. And here we've attracted some neutrophils. We could also activate the complement system. And depending on where these immune complexes lodge, we can get a lot of different symptoms. So they could lodge in the blood vessels, in the heart and lungs, joints, the skin, and also the kidneys. So here's some examples of type 3 hypersensitivity reactions. So one of them is rheumatoid arthritis. So that's actually an autoimmune disease. And we end up with these immune complexes getting stuck in the joints, and that will cause inflammation of the joints and lead to erosion of the joints, and we get rheumatoid arthritis. Here's vasculitis right below there. This is on someone's lower leg, ankle area, and you can see how the blood vessels have been damaged by the inflammation, but from the immune complexes binding there. And that causes the blood vessels to leak blood underneath the skin, and you get this vasculitis. And the word vasculitis just means inflammation of the blood vessels. Another problem we can see with a type 3 hypersensitivity reaction is glomerulonephritis. And this is where the immune complexes get lodged in the glomeruli, the little filters of the kidneys. And that attracts the neutrophils and complement system and causes inflammation and actually will damage the kidneys. And so the person could end up going into kidney failure as a result. And then this picture up here on top is showing you the rash that is very typical that we see of lupus. So this is a vasculitis on the skin that we see, but people with lupus can have many different symptoms because these immune complexes can lodge in the joints and cause joint pain. They can lodge in the kidneys, causing glomerulonephritis. They can lodge in the pericardium around the heart and in the pleural around the lungs, causing heart and lung issues. So there's all kinds of problems that can happen with lupus. And then a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction. This one involves cell-mediated immunity. So we're going to be activating some helper T cells and cytotoxic T lymphocytes, and they're going to be causing some tissue damage. So this is really different than the first 3 hypersensitivity types. The first 3 involved antibodies and humoral immunity. So type 4 hypersensitivity reactions, because they involve the T lymphocytes, they're going to be cell-mediated immunity. They're also delayed. It takes about 1 to 2 days before we see the reaction. So we've got a couple examples. We'll look at the TB test, allergic contact dermatitis like poison ivy, or maybe you have a latex allergy. There are some autoimmune diseases that are type 4 hypersensitivity reactions, and also transplant rejections are type 4 hypersensitivity reactions. Here's a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction. This is allergic contact dermatitis. So here we have exposure to poison ivy. So the oil from the plant leaves will actually penetrate the skin and get eaten by some of the antigen-presenting cells like a dendritic cell or a macrophage. They'll present it to the helper T cells. We find the one that's the match for, And then they start dividing and produce some of the memory helper T cells along with the effector cells. But by the time that that all happens and you stimulate the helper T cells to divide, remember that all takes about 10 days. And by then the oil from the poison ivy plant will be gone, and so there's nothing to react to. So the first time you're exposed to poison ivy, you get no reaction. But if you're exposed a second time, the oil from the plant will get in through the skin, and then you've got those memory helper T cells that are already there, and so they will respond very quickly, and they will activate and send out some cytokines which will attract to that area some cytotoxic T lymphocytes and macrophages, and then they will start destroying the cells that are in that area, and then you get the rash that we see with poison ivy. And that all takes about a day or two to occur, so it's a delayed reaction. Here are some other examples of type 4 hypersensitivity reactions. One would be a TB test. So during a TB test, you're going to inject under the skin some pieces of the bacteria that cause TB. If you do not have TB or you've never had the TB vaccine, you don't already have the memory helper T cells. So you're going to get a red raised area, but it's not going to be very big, and so your test would be negative. But if you do have TB or you've had the TB vaccine, you already have those memory helper T cells, and they will be activated very quickly, and that's why you can read the TB tests in 2 or 3 days, and you can see that red hard swelling, and they actually will measure that, and depending on how big that is, that will determine whether you're positive for TB or not. Another example of a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction is a latex allergy. So there are some people that are allergic to latex gloves, for example. And so all this damage to the skin, that's all caused by cytotoxic T lymphocytes and macrophages. So they've done that. And then down here is a link to a really nice animation that shows you how the type 4 hypersensitivity reactions work. Here's a nice summary of the 4 different hypersensitivity reactions. So make sure you know the mechanism of each one and then be able to recognize or give examples of each one. So for example, type 1 hypersensitivity reactions involve the IgE antibodies that are stuck in the membrane of the mast cell and basophils. And when the allergen binds, that'll trigger the release of the histamine. And so that'll cause localized responses like maybe hay fever or asthma, maybe hives. And then we can also get systemic anaphylaxis. And then type 2 hypersensitivity reactions are cytotoxic. They involve the IgG and IgM antibodies sticking to the target cell, and then those cells will get destroyed. And so we talked about blood transfusion reactions and also hemolytic disease of the newborn. Type 3 hypersensitivity reactions involve the immune complexes, which lodge in the blood vessels in the tissue, and that causes inflammation and damage. And some examples there were rheumatoid arthritis, we talked about lupus, glomerulonephritis, and also vasculitis. And then type 4 hypersensitivity reactions are the only ones that involve the T lymphocytes. There's no antibodies involved in this one. And the cytotoxic T lymphocytes and macrophages end up damaging healthy cells, and that causes things like contact dermatitis, like with poison ivy, latex allergies, and then we also talked about the TB test. And then we'll talk about next the transplant rejection. That's also a type 4. And then the other thing to remember is just the timing of when you see symptoms. So remember, type 1 is immediate. And then types 2 and 3, they take a couple hours before we see symptoms. And then type 4 is delayed. It'll take 1 or 2 days to see the symptoms.